Okay, welcome this afternoon, everybody. Today we're going to be looking at chapter 2 of the text. Hopefully, you've been able to look at the presentation on the system. I know a lot of it might not have made a lot of sense. Anybody got a chance to attempt to read the chapter? No?
Yes, I was able to skim through a bit.
Skim through a bit. Okay. All right. Crap. I wanted to do something. I just want to turn off my camera here, um, so that you could get the focal point there. All right, back to the presentation. All right, so we're looking at chapter 2 of Exploring Leadership. If you were able to go through it, what you're realizing here is they're sort of going to be looking at the history of leadership studies, leadership and ethics studies, and we're going to be spending some time looking at that and the types of studies that would, or the types of theories that were developed or approaches that were developed across the period that was going on there. So it started off by looking at the overall perception of leadership as being perceived as some sort of prized or coveted phenomenon in society. So it's like this thing you have to win. So being in leadership has oftentimes been identified or given that symbolism of it being a prize that you have. Yeah. How many of you all get that impression that this feeling still exists? That leadership is some kind of prize that people get, some reward that people get. Anybody?
Yes, I think so. It's also the status attached to it. Um, and I guess in a way, I don't want to say fame, but if you get what I'm saying, the attention
The
that
attention,
comes
yeah,
with it. Yeah.
the attention and status. That's what you're talking about. Not fame, but
Yes,
status
yes.
that is associated with being known, and your job title is now CEO of a company or manager of this or managing director of that. So those leadership positions tend to bring to bear on certain people that that whole concept of it being a prize. Now, obviously, from the perception of the leader probably likes that whole thing. And for other people who may not necessarily be leaders, it's hated. So you'd see that there's a dichotomy in the way that people respond to leadership. And that for some people, the leader is somebody to be feared and revered and held up to high esteem, whereas others look at leaders as the status quo, what we don't want to become, the us and them syndrome. So you need to, well, the text starts by looking at that perception that people have towards leaders and leadership. All right. So this quotation here is quite interesting because leadership is one of the most observed and least understood phenomenon. That's still quite true, even though it was this guy wrote this statement back in 1978. It's still one of the most observed. If you look at the amount of studies and research that has been done about leadership, you'd realize that a lot of people pay a lot of attention to leadership because they give it a lot of importance. That's why you have this is just a small example of some of the more popular leadership textbooks and programs that have been developed over time. The leader in me great happens here, and this one is probably one of the most popular, the 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. Anybody's familiar with this one?
No.
Never know about Stephen Covey?
No, sir.
Hmm, interesting. What about the Leadership Experience by Daft? That's one that is utilized in colleges most. You realize we're actually using the same text as well. Anybody familiar with Tony Robbins? All right. All right. So what happens in a lot of what they call Fortune 500 companies? They spend a lot of money on leadership programs for their executive, simply because they are trying to develop um, leadership capacity within the organization by investing in it. And good companies tend to do that. They will invest in training and development for their staff to be able to take their organizations forward, because if you have well-trained leaders, it's likely that they would also be able to foster leadership development in the rest of the staff that they supervise. And that is something that a lot of more mature and progressive organizations will do um, in terms of this. And so the idea is that the area of the discipline is one that has developed a lot of business. A lot of authors have written about it. A lot of research has been done. A lot of, like, this guy Tony Robbins, he's very famous for motivational speaking, and a lot of motivational speakers have, jumped into this bandwagon of creating uh, processes of becoming good leaders or great leaders in 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 organizations or in any sphere of life, actually. So again, you notice, for example, this Tony Unleash the Power Within by Tony Robbins is a program that he ran during 2020. And this is one that he goes around the whole country, um, the whole world, I should say, selling his services and that kind of stuff. There was a guy who used to do some executive leadership training here in Trinidad. What's his name? Uh, his name escapes me at the moment, but I, he eventually became. I think he was on the ethics board, not the ethics board. We Somebody might remember this here. There's a board that the Integrity Commission, right? I think he became chairman of the Integrity Commission at one point in time, and also served on the Police Complaints Authority as well. He had, I think it's Brooks, something Brooks. I think he runs programs for and does retreats for executives to be able to help develop their leadership skills and development. So these guys getting a little touch of some of that here. So let's start with the whole where this comes from. So the construct of leadership makes it very hard to define, because leadership means so many different things to different people. And the problem is that leadership takes place in different ways, in different circumstances, and therefore it will be viewed in different countries and different cultures very differently. Now, that creates a problem, because if you have so many different perceptions of something, it'll be very difficult to nail down a definition of what is leadership. And that is problematic across the board, because if you can't define something, then it becomes even more difficult to be able to observe it and scientifically explain its concepts. What do you all think about that problem that first starts off with defining what is actual leadership? Or do you think you have a fairly clear idea of what leadership is? Because the definition is still unclear. All right, so we require some response here, guys. Nobody has an opinion about defining leadership? No?
Hello. Oh,
No, you go ahead.
Okay. I think it's still unclear as well because I guess everybody has a different opinion of who a leader is or what are the requirements or what it is they think a leader should possess. So that's why I think it's hard to put a direct definition for what a leader is. Sorry.
So, what do you think a leader is? Let's look at what you perceive
Okay.
to be.
Um, I think a leader is one who sets an example. So therefore, any things that he or she does, in the way that they handle things, so it's, I guess for me, it's about what it is the leader does. Is is that okay?
I mean, again, it's perception. So
Yes,
you're not
perception.
right or
Yes,
wrong.
yeah.
It's the way you feel about it that makes it. Who was the gentleman that was joining you before?
Yeah, 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 yeah. Me.
Who's
Um,
me?
this is Christian.
All right, so I can't see your names because my screen is full with the
Oh, that's
presentation.
all right. That's all right. I guess some people they would view leadership differently. Like some would view it as a leader, and then others would view it as a boss. Where I guess in the other class you explained the difference between a boss and a leader.
Right, right, that makes sense. Especially in the context of a business organization. All right, but in other contexts, like in the family or in the home or in church and stuff like that, leadership takes on a different role.
Mm-hmm.
You understand? So that is another aspect of where leadership takes place. So again, different circumstances lead to different expectations of people and different perceptions of who's leading. So if you're in a church, you expect your leaders to be the priests and those persons in charge. Um, I'm a Hindu, so therefore, in my situation, what we're talking about is the pundits and those in charge in the associations that exist there, and in different religions. Then the Imam, for example, in Islam. Am I correct, Ms. Prasad?
Yes, sir.
Right? And so, therefore, we treat leadership differently, but similarly in some instances. And therefore, this is where you get the whole idea that some leaders in different types of circumstances are feared and revered, and some are even hated by other people. So you understand that where that linkage comes from. Now, moving forward, now what we have a situation generally. One of the things that we're looking for from our leaders is to find solutions. We have so many issues outside there, and what we really want them to be able to do is to guide us towards getting or finding solutions to those problems. I've been noted a few of them here from a global perspective, but you could add other common things like climate change, globalization, poverty, access to healthcare, education, and other public services critical to basic survival. Can you think of any other global or very serious problem that is facing us, that we want to have a leader or leaders to take responsibility and help us find solutions? Anybody else can suggest other things, and this could be totally within Trinidad itself. You don't have to go internationally. Would you say crime might be one that we're looking at from a national perspective?
Yes, sir.
Violence against women?
So what about COVID-19?
Well, that's a healthcare issue,
Okay, cool.
right?
Like a pandemic.
The pandemic, yeah, that's a huge one right
Yeah.
now. It's a major concern, and it creates problems because we want our leaders to find and provide for us a solution that we can follow. And I mean, if you look around the world, everybody seems to have different methodologies that they're utilizing. So, which one's working? And that's what the world is looking at, right? So they're looking at all these different leaders doing different things. Early on, you all remember this leader from New Zealand was lauded, very she was applauded as being very progressive in her thinking. The Prime Minister of New Zealand. in dealing with the pandemic issues. You've noticed that right now you're not hearing much about them now. Any of you all remember that?
Yes, sir. But we're really not hearing anything about New Zealand anymore, right?
That's what I'm saying. So is it that no news is good news? Or is it that because things are going well, it's not good new value? If you understand.
Actually knowing us, so the most regular mainstream media not publishing or taking place in New Zealand.
Well, that's what I'm saying.
You know what I'm saying?
Maybe because there's no excitement there, they've kind of
Yeah.
got under control, and therefore they're not too.
Actually, no, don't want don't want the public to be aware what is taking place because low key mainstream media we wouldn't really look out. They had to look outside of the box other than CNN and BBC and these places
Yeah.
because up to yesterday I was reading an article was sent to me from a news feed from Israel. They were
Right.
the same principle with New Zealand and Norway, and they
Right.
were almost over 90% fully what you call it vaccinated.
Uh-huh.
But they have the situation now is the fully vaccinated are the super spreaders. So
Right.
the low key in the publicity of it.
Yep.
Yeah, the low
Because
key in it.
it's interesting that you brought up the issue with Israel because that there's also evidence indicating that the vaccines are not really helping. They're just, as you said, they're helping to spread the disease. So
Yeah. Well,
kind of weird.
actually, I think they're looking at maybe even possibly giving the citizens up to four shots.
Yeah, I heard about this four
Yeah.
booster shots, and I'm telling
And
myself,
then this
how
morning
many?
I was reading an article where they said the Johnson and Johnson vaccine,
Uh-huh.
after 6 months, the efficacy drops to as low as below 10%.
Right. So that definitely means you have to get a booster shot. That not sounding good because how many of you all in the group here? I mean, and you don't are vaccinated? Just out of
I'm
curiosity.
vaccinated. I have been vaccinated since July.
Uh-huh.
With the Sinopharm vaccine. Yeah.
Did you notice any sort of side effect that when you got it?
Yes. For sure. I didn't really. Okay, so I didn't have a temperature, but I would feel like certain parts of my body would feel like it's on fire.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I guess. I mean, that was after a while. That lasted for a little while, but after the first 2 3 days, I had stuff like um, body pain. The second dose was a bit harsh. It was very painful. My arm was in a lot of pain. Yeah.
Do you have any pre-existing conditions?
No, I have no pre-existing conditions. And in a matter of fact, neither does my parents. And right now, my mom, she is COVID positive.
Oh, okay.
So,
How's she
and
managing?
well, I don't live with her, so I guess the hardest part of it all is not being able to go to take care of her, to visit or anything like that. But
Right.
she's doing okay. And she, like I said, no conditions before.
Was she vaccinated as well?
Yes, we were all fully vaccinated since July.
Right.
We took the Sinopharm vaccine.
When it first came out, right? Yeah. All right.
Yes.
Cool. Because that was the first vaccine that we had available here. No, we had AstraZeneca, but it was reserved more for the healthcare services. Um, Mr. Walker, your group was also identified as key personnel for that too. Yes.
Yes, we were. We offered, I think, the AstraZeneca,
Yeah. The
but
AstraZeneca.
from run of the mill talk, not official,
Uh-huh.
is something like is only about less than 40% took it.
Right. Even in the nursing population, I understand that there was a uh, relatively poor turnout, and I know
Yeah. Well,
teachers.
actually, the few officers that I know personally who actually took it, a few of them got sick bad and ended up on sick leave for more than 7 to 14 days.
Right.
They actually got
Yeah,
sick.
some of the the AstraZeneca versions, because I got the Sinopharm, I did have some minor symptoms. Basically, I felt absolutely wiped out. I had some a bit of dizziness or spacey feeling after the vaccinations. Both the first and the second vaccine, I had similar type of reactions. But I have an existing condition of I have allergies, so it creates a challenge for me. So I was kind of being very careful with it. But a lot of people complained about being very, very ill after having the vaccine. Some people even having minor strokes and stuff like that after it. It was very concerning, and therefore, what we're looking for is we're looking towards those people who are in positions of leadership, helping us to navigate through this thing. But of course, we have so many different um, point of views being presented to us that it creates confusion, and therefore, with that confusion, it creates doubt in our leadership. And this is something that leaders have to deal with as well. Um, Interesting question, though. Do you think that leaders really are the ones who should be pointing us pointing out or finding solutions, or should we collectively be finding solutions? What do you all think about that?
So my response to that is a twofold thing, I should say. In that well, when I was growing up, my father used to tell me there are leaders and there are followers.
Mm-hmm.
My father used to tell me that when I was small growing up. He said, make up your mind which one you are, a leader or a follower. That's one. And with regards to the question you're asking, I would add to that, are the leaders we have now genuinely honest enough to deal with? Because the population looking for leaders to actually guide us in a way with genuine honesty, more or less.
Right.
Are they really doing that?
And that is where the concern comes up, because we are unsure of what is happening, and as a result, sometimes their behavior indicates that they're not trustworthy, and that creates a challenge for us as well. So the issue is, can we afford to leave leaders by themselves to come to decisions? Or is it that there needs to be consensus with followers to be able to do that? And that's one of the things that we're going to be looking at in the nature of the development of thinking about leadership, especially from this text. So you could kind of keep those in mind when we're talking about these things. All right, so let's move forward here. And we just sort of hinted at this. Far too often, leaders disappoint us because they don't actually find solutions, and whatever they do, it leads to a high level of distrust in their behavior, and therefore we start to develop this whole. And I know I felt this. I have this anti-leadership feeling sometimes, because bad examples of seeing leaders behave in certain way and behave in certain manners, and see the negativity has affected me a lot. But the problem that then leads to is that people who ought to be in leadership positions no longer are attracted to taking up those positions of leadership because of the problems associated with being a leader. Because although being a leader is rewarding, it is also a frustrating experience because of the way people respond to it. And we have this growing distrust in all our societies, that have led to leaders becoming the focal point of a lot of animosity that's thrown towards them. So it's interesting that the book terms it anti-leadership vaccine. So when you see this happening, it discourages people from wanting to take leadership positions and leadership roles in society around us, especially those persons who probably are best suited for leadership. And you find these really skeptical individuals rising or offering themselves up, and then you have very little choice. And this is something I've seen in political spheres for a long period. Here in Trinidad, there are a lot of people who have become senators. No, not so much senators, but more MPs and stuff like that. I don't think they represent the best individuals that our society can produce to to help to move us forward. And that might be because of the way in which our politics is dealt with here and how the party system works. So I'm hoping that you all can see this whole problem here of the anti-leadership behavior that's taking place that helps to create this problem. So again, the nature of leadership is tricky in the beginning just to define, but also the way we respond to it has been over the years becoming more and more problematic as people have become more and more distrusting of those people in leadership positions.
But
Um,
so, excuse,
yeah,
is it that the leaders that we appoint, be it political or
otherwise, yeah.
otherwise, is it that they have influencers?
You have to clarify that when you say
Like,
influencers,
say, for instance, the politicians, it
right?
is alleged that the financiers have a greater say in the decision making.
Oh, okay. You're talking about, and that then is part of the whole distrust that comes up because the
Well, not
person,
really, but even if you go back down to the community level, say when we had chief and head of the home and all this kind of thing for the
right?
village, all this kind of thing.
Uh,
Like the father would be the head of the family or the elder, and if you go up there, you have the chief and that community group, right?
right,
But then when you look at the new politics of the nowadays, you're looking at the political party. The commander, the MPs come rally in the community for votes.
right.
Everybody say, I use the best one. Everybody vote for you. But then when you come together in cabinet or wherever in your own caucus, you change your agenda.
Right, and that's because the way the system currently works is that the agenda is not being set by the society, but it's been set by a subset of society that has power. And again, we can argue this because the perception is that those who have power, not necessarily political power, but political influence, and that would be where you're bringing up the concept of financiers, are the ones who are really influencing the decision makers and policy makers to develop policies that will favor their thinking and their positions and point of view. And that is where the level of distrust becomes even greater because now, because sometimes well, as we have this saying, what happens in the dark comes to the light. Some of the decisions that are made by these individuals eventually become very transparent in their implication. I remember one specific one that came up with the EMA Act and the OSHA Act. For anybody who remembers that, the original acts for both those agencies, the OSHA agency and the EMA agencies, were so powerful. It gave both authorities a lot of power over the operations and behavior of people in business, construction, and generally across the board. And the legislation was heavily criticized by the business sector because they viewed it as being highly intrusive because it made businesses liable for certain types of things that could happen and they could be charged and whatnot. So what ended up happening with the legislation when it was brought before the legislators is that it was diluted, certain parts were removed, so that basically they created these agencies, but the agencies lacked any form of legislative toot to be able to do anything. I remember going to the ocean. All Ocean could have done, because I had a environmental issue that was taking place and I was having a problem. And all they could have done was ask the organization to listen to my plea. And I thought, well, what's the point of coming to Ocean if all they can do is request that an organization look into a complaint that I had been dealing with. And I found it was really fun. Then that actually, I went in and looked at the act itself, and I saw where, okay, right, yeah, the right in terms of the way the act is written, it circumvents them being able to take any direct or heavy-handed action against any organization to protect workers.
Well, but you're correct because sometime early last year, I drove into the Etihad Savannah.
Uh-huh.
You know the Dutch food court area. I
Yeah.
drove into the Etihad Savannah like about midday, and the barriers that secure the car park, one of the barrier, they have nothing securing it. And I had to say, thank God I was just driving at cruising speed, and I just hear buzz, and I look the barrier come straight to my windshield. Right, and I was like, what the? So I made the necessary reports, took the photos, whatever. Well, the insurance fixed it for me immediately by 6 o'clock in the evening. My windshield was replaced.
Right.
Right, but the thing is, the regional corporation who responsible for the Etihad Savannah took all the reports. Up to now, they ain't compensate me yet. And they're telling me I had to get a lawyer because once my insurance already fixed it, them don't see the need to compensate me anymore. I was like, what?
Yeah, but the insurance company has to be reimbursed.
No, well, what the insurance company is saying, they because I have windshield coverage,
Yeah.
so them not going and run any of it.
They're not going to claim against somebody else.
Yeah,
If it was any other form of damage to the vehicle besides
yeah,
the windscreen,
yeah.
they would have tried to charge. So it kind of caught between a
Yeah, because the windshield itself was like what 1,800 or something like that.
yeah.
And to pay an attorney, I had to do the
It's a
maths.
lot
To
more
pay an
money.
attorney,
Yeah.
yeah,
And
it's like
that's part.
34 cents.
Yeah, that's part of the problem of taking anything to court. It's an expensive process, and our attorneys here don't operate on what is called pro bono. They want to get paid for anything. I mean, some do act, for the benefit of some people by taking cases without um, taking fees, at least initially. But if there's a settlement, then they will want a part of that settlement as compensation, which, to be honest, is fair, because if they did all the work for free, then whatever gains you make from it. But at the end of the day, most times what happens is that the lawyer fees are worked into the settlement. But the idea is that it dissuades a lot of individuals from taking matters further because of the sheer cost of doing the activity. And you're right, um, it creates problems because agencies that are supposed to be protecting us just don't have the legislative power or the judicial power, the legal power to be able to act in defense of people. And this is something that makes me in particular, because I've seen this happen far too often. It's happening right now with the Procurement Act, which is why it's not even been proclaimed, because Procurement Act does not really do anything to protect the nation against the kind of underhanded procurement activities that take place within government and with government services. So it's something that a lot of us who pay attention to what's happening at that level, because I know some of you all already just kind of bored and want us to move on because um, you already pay attention to what's taking place in Parliament. But you have to understand the importance of Parliament is where policies have been put in place that guide behaviors and activities in the rest of our society. So, how many of you all remember the what was it? There was an act that became the act to remove buggery from the um as a crime. You all remember that?
Will you repeat that, sir? Sorry.
Sorry?
Will you repeat that? Sorry.
Oh, okay, not taken on. How many of you all remember the the act, the repealing of the Buggery Act in Trinidad, and how the LGBT society got involved with that whole thing, and the sort of backlash that created?
Yeah, I don't remember that,
You don't remember
unfortunately.
that?
What year was that?
That
But
was last
I was
year.
that was recently. That was like about 2019, so about it.
Yeah, it was just before the
Yeah,
pandemic. Yeah,
Hmm.
they were marching in front of the Red House and all kind of thing.
yeah,
But that came about sometime a little while after the introduction of the New Children's Act. New
correct.
Children's
It came up as part of our whole suite of changes in
Yeah.
legislation, and certain parties started to look at the removal of the Buggery Act as being something that supported homosexual behavior, especially among men, because that law outlawed anal sex, even between consenting adults. Um, and this meant sex with anybody, a male or female. It didn't matter. All right. Once you're doing it, it's against the law. You all right? Somebody wanted to say something. Anyway, coming back to Margaret. So the whole idea is that at this point in time, there's a lot of disillusionment with current leadership, and this is one of the problems that we have to face when we're dealing with the whole issue of what leadership is and how people respond to it, because it is something that people have a lot of problems dealing with. All right, so current research kind of provides us some insight into leadership today. So the modern view has looked at a number of the myths that have existed over time, and we need to kind of look at them to understand why these myths not only have been overturned, but how it's going to impact the practice of the model that we're going to be looking at. All right. So, in different contexts, the practice of leadership is going to be different. So a lot of you are parents, and it means that you are in a leadership position, and the nature of leadership in the household is going to be different to the nature of leadership in a classroom, in a business place, in a social group, be it like a youth group or a church group or something along those lines, a non-profit organization or a for-profit organization. So the behavior and the context of leadership really impacts upon how leadership is defined and worked or utilized in it. So let's look at some of these myths. Leaders are born, not made. That's a myth. Would you be? You look at the myths and you tell me how much of these you might have accepted as being true of leadership today. Leaders are born, not made. Leadership is hierarchical, and you need to hold a formal position, have status and power to be considered a leader. You have to have charisma to be an effective leader. There is one way of leading. It is impossible to be a manager and a leader at the same time. And you only really need to have common sense to be an effective leader. So, how you all feel about those myths? Are there any others? Right. So let's go back to the how you all feel about those myths? Any of them appear to you as well? Yeah, that's true.
So, when they stated that leaders are
Born.
born, not made, sorry, I
Mm,
believe that.
really? Okay. So why are you doing this course?
Oh,
Why are you doing this course?
no, sorry, I think I mixed it up. Oh, Lord. Sorry. I meant to say leaders are made and not born.
Well, but
Sorry.
but the myth is leadership is born. Leaders are born.
Oh, okay. Well, I don't agree with that.
Right. Okay. But any of the others strike you as being true today?
Um, there's one salary of leader,
I don't think there's one standard way of leading. I'm sure there are various ways you can lead.
right?
Yeah.
All right, so let's look at how they went on to disassociate these things. Truths about leadership. Leaders are made, not born. So that's the truth. Many people have the capacity to lead, but do not see themselves as leaders in a traditional manner, and that's part of the problem, because a lot of the traditions have held leadership as being something that people are born with innate personality traits and so on. It discourages a lot of people from taking leadership positions because they feel as if, well, leadership is not for me. I am not a leader. So leaders aren't born with innate characteristics or skills, if you think about it from that perspective. And a person's environment will be able to influence their development. So there's certain things that help to develop leadership skills in both from what happens at home, what happens in school, what happens in society that you operate in. So a combination of those things help to develop leadership, and this is something that it kicks against what happened in the past, where people were only leaders because they were born into leadership positions because of their family connections. You could see that with royalty. You can't be a king or a queen or a prince or whatnot unless you either A, are born into it, or B, marry somebody who's in the family. And we see how problematic marrying into monarchs or royalty is, given the situations with Princess Diana to start with, and then of late this situation with Prince Harry and oh God, I could never pronounce her name. That really nice girl. Anybody knows what I'm talking about?
Yes, sir, Meghan Markle.
Megan, right? Right, yeah. Yeah, that and that brought up another aspect too, right? I mean, she's a girl of mixed racial or ethnic backgrounds, and that brought up a whole can of worms there. So there's a whole host of other issues that come up with that. So you understand, a lot of people look at her and said she's not royalty. She can't be royalty because she's of mixed blood. That's actually a feature of how many people were fans of the Harry Potter series?
Me too.
Yeah, you know what a mudblood is?
That is when you're born with no regular humans. Yeah, regular humans.
No, that's a muggle. A muggle is a regular human.
Oh, a mix.
A mudblood is somebody whose one parent is magical and another parent is a muggle. You understand? And what was that whole battle with Voldemort about?
Honestly, it's been a while since I
You okay?
watched the
The
movie.
battle with Voldemort was that they believe that it was incumbent upon the magical people to be in charge of the world, and Muggles were inferior and therefore needed to be brought to bear as what they were perceived to be as slaves and servants to the magical class, and anybody of mixed blood would be deemed to be unworthy. Didn't think a book like Harry Potter was about such deep things, huh? Interesting, or a film for that matter. All right, so we understand this whole concept that leaders are made, not born, right? What about this one? Leadership occurs at all levels of organizations. This is the truth. It doesn't mean that leadership only exists at the top of an organization, but it exists at various levels of the organization. Especially if the organization is one that is progressive in nature and is striving to flatten their hierarchies. Which team is dealing with complex organizations? Which chapter is that? Anybody remembers?
So I think that's chapter 8.
Is it chapter 8?
Yeah.
Complex organizations is actually chapter 9. Sorry, yes, chapter 8, correct. And it's Miss Hippolyte and Miss Archer Royer, Rebecca and Joella, sorry.
It's Joel, sir. Yeah.
Joel, okay. I could never get that right. That LE at the end there is something. So you guys are going to be dealing with this in more detail moving forward with that. Okay?
Yes, sir.
So I'm hoping you guys will be able to pull that together and show us that this is true, that leadership exists at different levels throughout the different organization. And it means that it gives more people opportunities to experience and develop leadership power or leadership skills. And that's important for the longevity of an organization, because you don't want your current leaders to die off or retire and move off. And then you're left with a vacuum in the organization where things just kind of fall apart because it lacks leadership. So that's something that you want to pay attention to there. Charisma is not a prerequisite for leadership, and that's quite true. You do not have to be charismatic in order to be a good and effective leader. The problem that comes up is because charisma has a very particular unnerving effect on people. So, as this author, and I will not pronounce it, I think it's Yuko, charismatic leaders have a profound and unusual effect on followers. They are seen as visionaries and have strong desires for power and can easily motivate others. And that's because charismatic leaders have the uncanny ability to attract people through their emotional responses to things. And the problem with that is that charismatic leaders have, have proven to be problematic and dangerous in the past. I think this guy says something here. You all should be familiar with this guy, Peter Drucker. He's a very important writer in management and leadership studies. A lot of his work is now, he still does work in that area. Any of you all ever looked at his work? No? But look at what he says here. He says the three most charismatic leaders in the 21st century, or the 20th century, I should say, inflicting more suffering on the human race than almost any trio in history. And he identifies Hitler, Stalin, and Mao. What matters is not the leader's charisma, but what matters is the leader's mission, what they want to do. You all are familiar with these three individuals that he's referring to: Hitler, Stalin, and Mao?
Yes, sir.
Uh-huh.
But then my mind ran across another charismatic leader, but I don't think he would have killed as much people. That's
There are lots
Jim
of
Jones.
Yeah, well, he's going to come up in a photograph later on, but
Okay.
he's not as big as these guys. Hitler was
Yeah.
big as people. Stalin
And
was
if you go further back, you check Shaka Zulu in that too.
correct. Yes, yeah. It depends on. That's why he was talking about only those within this century.
Yeah.
He was referring to the 20th century. All right. So you'd understand there that charismatic leadership has by far created bigger problems than what we're talking about. And I brought up some charismatic leaders in history. We have a couple that are good and a couple that are bad. And my friend has identified one, the Reverend Jim Jones down here. For those of you who are unfamiliar with him, anybody knows the Jim Jones story? He wasn't actually a reverend, by the way, and he was a Dr. Reverend Jim Jones. Didn't have a doctorate either. You all familiar with him? I mean, we all know Hitler, we know Mahatma Gandhi, and we know Martin Luther King, because throughout history we've seen them, and they're all charismatic. There are others who are charismatic, and I put this gentleman here, these two gentlemen on this side, because they are negative charismatic and these are positives. All right, and there are lots of history around it. But as I said, Hitler impacted a lot more people, but Jim Jones was critical because of, well,
He was a cult leader.
Yeah, the way in which it was done and how close it was to the, because he's also compared to people like not Marilyn Manson, but Charles Manson, and well, uh, more recently he's also compared to David Koresh. For those people who might be familiar with it, the Moonies, that's another set. Even Scientology comes into that whole thing there, um, because they utilize charismatic people in their organization to try and sell the concept of Scientology as a religion or a way of thinking, um, to be able to move their ideas forward. Everybody knows what he, besides Mr. Walcott, who's obviously familiar with Mr. Jim Jones, what Mr. Jones did. Mr. Walcott, let's give some of the people a chance.
I have no idea.
You ever heard the phrase, don't drink the Kool-Aid? Or I drank. All right. He's responsible for that phrase.
Is he the one who got people to drink Kool-Aid and kill themselves or something?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
That's where that came from. His entire congregation was well, vast majority of them willingly drank this Kool-Aid laced with cyanide and died in Guyana. All right. So let's move on. So this is the problem with charisma. Charisma is a double-edged sword that if not wielded by people who are fairly ethical in their thinking and behavior, and become problematic over time. All right. So there's not one right way to lead, and I think Mr. Smith Christian talked about this. There's no one way. There are many ways to lead, and that leadership approach will be influenced by the person themselves, their gender, their cultural identity, their value systems. They're going to, and even the model that we're looking at, it identifies that you can use different various methods of leadership to be able to, or leadership styles to get things done. Now, the truth, the importance of distinguishing between management and leadership. So we need to define clearly what is the difference between management and leadership, because you can manage something but not be a leader, or you can be a leader and not really be dealing with management. So there's some distinctions. So in essence, a manager is looking after an organization to try and make sure that they are getting the best for that organization, which means they're looking at the bottom line and profit levels and so on. So they are going to, their purpose would be to arrange the resource allocations, and that will include human resource, in such a manner as to get the most out of people to be able to translate into the most amount of revenue. Now, leadership, on the other hand, is not necessarily going to be about that. It goes on here to talk about management is bound closely to institutional ideals and objectives, and they are always going to be focused on doing things the way in which it will lead to the greatest profitability. Now, a leader, on the other hand, will be focused on doing things the right way. Now, that brings up a whole host of what defines something as being right, and that has to do with ethics. Now, so managers and leaders, it seems to be a bit of a dichotomy, but there is a situation where you can be a good, effective manager and an effective leader simultaneously, and that's what the model is going to try to get us to be looking at. So there are the distinctions, but there's a big overlap between the two, because if you are going to get the best out of people, you can't get the best out of people by threatening them. You will get better performance from people if you treat people with more care and consideration, and that's something that a lot of leadership models really didn't look at the beginning of the process. They were just looking at forget the soft skills, just do what I tell you to do, or else look for another job, and that might have worked in the past, but although really and truly there's lots of organizations that have management or managers that behave in that way, and as many managers as I've met, every one of them operates and behaves and manages their activities very differently. They tend to be very personalized behaviors that you look at. So leaders who perform managerial tasks such as allocating resources and organizing systems need to be effective managers and perform those functions well. It is possible for a person to be an effective leader while being an effective manager. So there's a blend of the two that is possible, but it requires a lot more work. Okay. All right. So one big truth about leadership is that leadership is a teachable thing. It's a skill that we can develop with people, whether or not they have an innate sense of the concept. And this kind of dissuades us from thinking that leadership is common sense. Yes, there's a certain amount of common sense involved with it, but generally you can develop and improve your leadership skills if you do the training, which is one of the reasons why there's so many leadership training exercises and programs that exist around us. And I like this particular thing here. Leadership is about developing as a leader. It usually requires a lifelong commitment to preparation, experience, trial and error, self-examination, and a willingness to learn from mistakes and successes. And that means that you're always going to be learning about leadership and leadership exercises and your own personal development every time you get involved with leadership-based activities. And I've actually, even in teaching this course, I've taught this course so many times that every time I do the course, it always leads me to re-examining certain things that I did in the past and certain behaviors, because it's a constant learning and relearning and reshaping, looking at the, as I said, trial and errors, mistakes and successes, trying to make sure that, hey, I made this mistake last time, let's try and not do that again. Because it requires that you already think about what you're doing to be able to assess whether or not you're doing it the right way, or maybe if I tweak it this way, it'll get a little better, that kind of stuff. Even teaching styles is the same thing that works for that. All right. So how do we go about defining, or how was leadership defined? The term leader actually is traced in the English language, first used in about the 1300s. The word leadership emerged in the 1800s. So leader came up in the language in the 1300s. The word leadership emerged in the 1800s and was used in the context of political influence. So immediately you could start seeing that leadership and leaders were heavily connected to power and influence. All right. Now, by the 1900s, there were a few formal definitions of leadership. As we move to the 1980s, all right, by the 1980s, you had a lot more definitions, all right, but most of the definitions were actually going to be couched in academic studies. And at least 221 definitions could be found in books and publications. So a lot of people in doing their PhDs and master thesis studies would have spent a lot of time observing leadership and trying to set up definitions for books and other publications. So that's basically research driving the whole concept. There were at least 366 publications. This is only an examination of the American experience in this situation. American and European experience, I should say. That's across the board there. All right. So writing about it or trying to define leadership is something that took time to develop over this period. So this is an early definition from the 1900s. It's the preeminence of one or a few individuals in a group in the process of control of societal phenomena. That's interesting because here you're looking at almost like what we refer to as a puppet master approach. So it portrays the leader as a controller of events and infers control over people. Early definitions, therefore, describe leadership as one person controlling others or inducing them. I like the word used here of inducing them to follow his or her commands. And that's an interesting thing. That's why I said this speaks to the more master of puppets type of definition. from the 1907 to 1906 to 1907. Contemporary definitions describe leadership as a relational process, sort of like what the one we're looking at now, as leadership is the relational situation that exists between a leader and followers in the accomplishment of a particular task or objective. So that's more contemporary look, but other aspects existed prior to that. So, and it speaks to the interaction between both sets of leaders and followers working together. So let's look more at um, the way in which the definitions were developed over time. So you'd realize that we talked a lot about the various fields that contributed to the development of leadership studies. So anthropology, psychology, history, sociology, the arts, and philosophy, and of course interdisciplinary. So you had psychosocial, you had history and anthropology working together, you had arts and sciences working together, and especially philosophy would be one that kind of brought things together. They had a lot of general studies that contributed to leadership development. In the latter part of the 70s and 80s, they started to try to use, especially in psychology and sociology, a scientific approach to the studies, and we'll see how that works out with the whole problem. Today, we know that there is not one correct definition of leadership. And that therefore causes us to come back to the same question: what is the purpose of leadership? What is its function? And therefore, to define the function, we have to look at the context that the leadership is taking place in, and that's something that some of the earlier theories did not deal with. So, in order to help with the definitions, they used a number of metaphors. Everybody's familiar with what the word of metaphor is, right? Metaphor is a comparison that's not fully stated, doesn't use as or like in its language. Yes? So you have the competitive market metaphor, the consensus metaphor, the administrative metaphor, the anarchy metaphor, collective bargaining metaphor, the independent judicial metaphor, judiciary, sorry, metaphor, the democratic metaphor, and plebiscite. I can never get this right. You know. Blah 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 blah. Autocratic metaphor. Plebiscitary. Plebiscitary. I think that's it. Plebiscitary autocratic metaphor. Anybody wants to correct me with that pronunciation? Plebiscitary. Yeah. No? Well, if we ignore the plebiscitary book, what we're going to be taking here is autocratic. Anybody understands what autocratic is? No? Is there anybody there?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, so we here now.
Yeah. It's just feeling like I'm getting left alone. Right. Okay, so with that in mind, let's take a 10-minute break and we'll come back to it at this point in time. I'll pause the recording for now. And we'll take a bit of a break and come back because I feel I'm losing all you.